Here we are right back where we left off. I'm going to flip on over to the next page here. And this is the start of chapter 1. Okay. Again, I want to remind you that this story is written by Roald Dahl, who is an author from England. Okay, so we might see some different words in here. We might see some different spelling. It's also an older story. So, it might be a little bit of a stop and have to figure out with context clues what these words might mean. But we're going to break it down together. So, chapter 1 is called Here Comes Charlie. And I see an illustration here of it looks like two people laying in a bed. So, let's see. These two very old people are the father and mother of Mr. Bucket. Their names are Grandpa Joe and Grandma Josephine. So that's referring to this picture here. We have Grandpa Joe and Grandma Josephine. And these two very old people are the father and mother of Mrs. Bucket. Their names are Grandpa George and Grandma Georgina. This is Mr. Bucket. This is Mrs. Bucket. Mr. and Mrs. Bucket have a small boy whose name is Charlie Bucket. This is Charlie. How do you do? And how do you do? And how do you do again? Looks like they're using a contraction here. D apostrophe U. If I had to use context clues and just from listening to that out loud, how do you do? It sounds like how do you do? He is pleased to meet you. The whole of this family, the 6 grown-ups, count them, and the little Charlie Bucket live together in a small wooden house on the edge of a great town. I see 1, 2, Grandpa George. I'm sorry, Grandpa Joe and Grandma Josie. I was struggling to say her name. Grandma Josephine, and then Grandpa George and Grandma Georgina. I was mixing up Georgina and Josephine. Okay, so Grandpa Joe 1, Grandma Josephine 2, Grandpa George 3, Grandma Georgina 4, Mr. Bucket 5, Mrs. Bucket 6, and then Charlie. And they live together in this small wooden house on the edge of town. Does that look like a house that you would want to live in? Thumbs up, yes. Thumbs down, no. Something to think about. The house wasn't nearly large enough for so many people, and life was extremely uncomfortable for them all. There were only 2 rooms in the place altogether, and there was only 1 bed. The bed was given to the 4 old grandparents because they were so old and tired. They were so tired, they never got out of it. I want you to remember that because this is kind of a frustration point with me, and you're going to notice there's one character that I don't particularly like because I think that they're slightly a faker. We'll talk about that as we get further into the story. But just remember, they're so old and so tired, they never get out of the bed. So, like, even to help with chores, nope. Get a job and help make money, nope. They stay in bed all day, which is fine if you need to. But interesting things happen. Grandpa Joe and Grandma Josephine on this side, Grandpa George and Grandma Georgina on this side. Mr. and Mrs. Bucket and little Charlie Bucket slept in the other room upon a mattress on the floor. In the summertime, this wasn't too bad, but in the winter, freezing cold drafts blew across the floor all night long, and it was awful. There wasn't any question of them being able to buy a better house or even one more bed to sleep in. They were far too poor for that. Mr. Bucket was the only person in the family with a job. He worked in a toothpaste factory where he sat all day long at a bench and screwed the little caps onto the tops of the tubes of toothpaste after the tubes had been filled. But a toothpaste cap screwer is never paid very much money, and poor Mr. Bucket, however hard he worked and however fast he screwed on the caps, was never able to make enough to buy 1/2 of the things that so large a family needed. There wasn't even enough money to buy proper food for them all. I'm going to have to pause here in just a second. The only meals they could afford were bread and margarine for breakfast, boiled potatoes and cabbage for lunch, and cabbage soup for supper. Sundays were a bit better. They all looked forward to Sundays because then, although they had exactly the same, everyone was allowed a second helping.